So hi everyone, this is the Conversations About Reading Tibetan series hosted by University of Toronto. And this series puts expert translators in conversation with students to discuss some of the challenges facing aspiring readers of the classical Tibetan language. Co-sponsored by the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of Toronto and Wisdom Publications, this initiative brings together a diverse group of scholars and students to help facilitate the study of Tibetan and make their insights accessible to the world. Today, we have the pleasure of inviting Professor Roger Jackson to join us for discussions on his translations of Mahamudra literature for his recent new book, Mind Seeing Mind, Mahamudra and the Geluk Tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, published by the Wisdom publication in 2019. And this book was also the winner of the 2020 Toshihide Numata Book Award in Buddhism. So congratulations, Professor, on that, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to see you.
Great. And today we're going to first discuss translating the genre of Mahamudra literature and some of its challenges with Professor Jackson. And then we'll actually took a look at one of the texts that Professor Jackson has been translating in his book, A 17th-Century Roots versus Text. So first of all, Professor, what was the experience, what was the process of translating Mahamudra literature in your new book like? What were some of the problems and challenges that you had to deal with?
There's plenty of challenges in translating Mahamudra literature. For one thing, it's important to remember that the very scope of the term Mahamudra literature is itself contested and uncertain and somewhat ambiguous. It's probably a little clearer in Tibet overall, where Mahamudra is a very distinct category of study and practice. But when you dig back into the Mahamudra literature in India that inspired the Tibetan traditions, you sometimes have a hard time knowing where to draw lines because Mahamudra came in Tibet, among many other things, to simply mean a meditation on the nature of mind / reality, and that covers a lot of ground when you think about Buddhist traditions, intellectual traditions, meditative traditions, and so forth. So one of the difficulties I had in sort of putting this volume together over many years, and in specifically then choosing translations, was deciding, okay, what's a Mahamudra text? Do we know for sure that X or Y, especially in the Indian tradition, but even sometimes in the Tibetan tradition, is really a Mahamudra text? Mahamudra, of course, means the Great Seal in Sanskrit. It's Chakya Chempo in Tibetan, which I think most listeners will know. So that's a kind of primary difficulty. But even when you've settled on text, and I selected Geluk text because this is a book on Mahamudra specifically in the Geluk tradition. Mahamudra is better known really for its great importance at the kind of heart of the Kagyu traditions. We better put that in plural, probably, but it's had an important part in Geluk at least since the 16th or 17th century, and arguably it may have had an important role before that. So I had to kind of settle in on texts to try to translate. The translation portion of my book is just sort of the last third of it. The first 2/3 is sort of historical background, doctrinal discussion, and so forth. Anyway. I did end up settling on a variety of texts, which I, in this case, selected to try to show the various ways in which Mahamudra was a significant term for Geluk. So the text that we'll be spending a little time talking about today is the sort of core text. It's the root verses written by the first or fourth Panchen Lama, Losang Chukyi Gyaltsen, probably around 1600. And it's above all a meditation instruction manual in verse, though it has other elements to it as well, ritual, philosophy, philosophical. It talks about lineage, it talks about text and so forth. But in the larger set of decisions I made about what to translate, I tried to find variety. So we have this meditation manual. I translated a somewhat later text that talks about the history of the lineage, because this is a very important genre in Tibetan literature. I translated poems that the Panchen himself had written that are Mahamudra themed. I translated his great ritual text, the Lama Chupa, or Offering to the Guru, which gives a kind of tantric ritual context for Mahamudra practices. Anyway, this gives you an idea. I don't have to go through all the different genres, but it's a way of showing that Mahamudra for the Gelugpa is in fact a kind of complete religious practice that has the many dimensions of religious thought, life, and practice in it in the Geluk. But stepping back for a second, just to the broader question about the difficulties of translating Mahamudra literature, there's sort of a couple of meta issues or meta problems that anybody who's interested in studying, practicing, or translating Mahamudra needs to address, namely that Mahamudra, most Mahamudra texts will be identified as something like Mengak, as like an esoteric instruction or a pith instruction. Many translations for that term exist in English. And it's presumed that actually it's originally an oral teaching that then gets written down. So we have, a whole lot of Mahamudra texts once we've decided what the bounds of that topic are. And yet we always have to appreciate the fact that this actually is part of an oral tradition, and those oral traditions continue today. So what we get in a written text is only, I don't know if it's fair to say it's the tip of the iceberg of this, but it's only partial. And, even behind that, there's a kind of, if you will, a kind of philosophical or theological meta problem, namely that almost every Mahamudra text will at some point or other clearly state that Mahamudra is inexpressible, indescribable, ineffable, in the classic sort of form of claims about ultimate reality in various religious traditions. So there's a level on which, even when you've said, okay, this is a text that has an oral background, there's a, if you will, there's a higher level on which whatever you're reading is not entirely accurate, in the sense that Mahamudra itself is indescribable. So, there's sort of textual problems, there's the questions of orality and versus written text, and then there's this meta problem of the alleged ineffability of Mahamudra. So these are all the kinds of things you have to work with as you try to make sense of this topic and the texts that are related to this topic.
Wow, thank you. That seems like a lot of things to consider when working with such a kind of literature. Going back to the root verses that you were mentioning by the first or the fourth Panchen Lama, which is also the text that we're going to be focusing on today for a little bit later. So in your book, you kind of mentioned that this root verses function as many things, right? As a ritual text, meditation manual, so on and so forth. Can you tell us a little bit about how this root verses function, and just give us a background so we'll know, what we're dealing with when we actually go into the text later?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, this helps to illustrate a couple of points I just made. One is this is the root verses on Mahamudra by the first/fourth Panchen. As most people know, there's two different counting systems. Nowadays, he's more often identified as the fourth. But in any case, he was the first Gelugpa to overtly write a Mahamudra meditation manual. Now, he himself claims in his root verses, and he also has an auto commentary on his root verses that elaborates on this a bit, that he's simply conveying the tradition that he received from his teacher, Kedrup Sangye Yeshe, who in turn received the tradition from Ensapa Losang Dundrup, who in turn received it from a kind of mysterious Mahasiddha by the name of Dharma Vajra or Chukyi Dorje. That's in a way as far back as the Panchen takes it, though in a different text, he does talk about a lineage of which he is a part that goes back to Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Geluk. He doesn't specifically in that text say, this is the Mahamudra lineage, but we could probably infer that that's what's going on here. So one of the issues that the Panchen had to face, and that Geluk was before him had faced, is that this was in fact a secret tradition, supposedly originally received by Tsongkhapa in visions of the Buddha/Bodhisattva Manju Gosha, and he received as well a what's called a Tulpe Lekbam, a magical book or an emanated scripture that contained various secret teachings, among them a Mahamudra teaching, and Tsongkhapa handed it on to one of his disciples, and so on, and it went down through the years, just one teacher to one disciple in principle, and nobody publicized it because, as various texts say, the time wasn't ripe yet. But the Panchen, for whatever reason, felt that the time was right, and therefore wrote this text, wrote a commentary on this text, and wrote a number of other Mahamudra-related texts, including this lineage history that I mentioned, and the Lama Chupa, the Guru Puja ritual, which is though it doesn't use the term Mahamudra, clearly has become linked to that, as well as these poems that I also translated. So it becomes the foundational text for all future and now highly public Mahamudra teachings among the Geluk, and it receives commentaries from many of the great luminaries of the Geluk tradition after Panchen Losang Chukyi Gyaltsen, and is, has been handed down into the, it was, it sort of went through, it waxed and waned a bit over the centuries. It was, the tradition was written the most about actually by Kachen Yeshi Gyaltsen in the 18th century, and then it was sort of revived again by Pabonka Rinpoche late in the 19th or early in the 20th century, and to the degree that Pabonka Rinpoche was the teacher of many of the main Geluk lamas of the mid to late 20th century, it's come down through the tradition, and everybody knows it, and quite a number of people practice it as well. So the Panchen's root text is the core of that, because it was, even though the tradition is traced to Tsongkhapa among humans, it was the Panchen who publicized the tradition, brought it into the larger realm of discussion, debate, and so forth.
Wow, really fascinating. I find the propagation of these root verses in the 20th century really fascinating, sort of related to what I study. But going back on one comment you made, there were also commentaries, right, that were also written. So can you tell us a little bit about these kinds of sources that you can use as a translator?
No, and I did my best to, I mean, there's a lot of literature out there. There's probably, sort of 4 or so actual word by word commentaries. What we would, one of the terms in Tibetan for this is a chikdrel, right? A commentary that goes word by word, or more likely verse by verse, sometimes explaining the meaning of each word, sometimes keeping it at the meaning of the verse. But there are a number of these that date, apart from the Panchen's own commentary on it, which was written probably some years after the root text, so probably sometime after 1600. Again, 1600 is an estimate for the date of the composition of the root verses. But there were commentaries written primarily in the 18th and the 19th centuries by a variety of important Geluk lamas. And you have to understand that, of course, religious history, religious thought, religious practice never stays the same. And the perspectives that are given in some of these later commentaries by, for instance, Yeshi Gyaltsen or Gung Tangpa, there's a number of these commentaries. Some are fairly short. Some of them are unbelievably long, and I'm unsure if one of them was even quite finished. But in any case, different lamas in different eras have different concerns, and one sort of way of of homing in on this as an issue when you read commentaries for a set of root verses like this is that Panchen Losang Chökyi Gyaltsen, as well as one of his disciples, a lama from Amdo, by the name of Kaldan Gyatso, who was a great Amdo poet also. Victoria Sujata has done wonderful work on his poetry. They include a lot of Kagyu references, a lot of Kagyu terminology in their explanations of this Geluk Mahamudra tradition. By the time you get down to Yeshe Gyaltsen in the 18th century, there's a way in which the tradition has become more, I guess I would use the word Gelukbified. That is, some of the Kagyu references drop away. More and more of the references are to the kind of standard masters recognized in the Geluk tradition. A lot of references to Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti and Atisha and so forth. Whereas the Panchen, as well as this kind of somewhat younger contemporary lama in Amdo, were definitely conversant with Kagyu literature, quoting Kagyu literature, using Kagyu terminology. So the point here is that you can look at later commentaries, and they may be very helpful in determining what, in fact, the original intent of the author may have been. But you have to be careful, because the agendas change. This is always an issue with commentary, after all. It's written from the standpoint of the commentator, who's in a different time and a different place, and sometimes writing in a different language. Here it's the same language. So you have to be careful in using these later commentaries. And while the Panchen's own commentary is, of course, authoritative in many respects, if you have particular issues that are of interest to you, you don't necessarily he isn't necessarily interested in those same issues. And there's an issue that we'll talk about momentarily, I think, when we begin looking at the text itself, that he simply just sort of passes over as not worthy of commentary, and yet it has become, this has to do with the title of the text, actually, and it's become an issue in many respects, particularly actually in the 20th and 21st centuries, for a variety of interpreters. So anyway, my general approach to translation, and I'm working now on translations of Saraha, the great Indian Mahasiddha poet, saint, etc. My general approach to translation is to be wary of commentary and not to assume that somebody writing 200 years later, 500 years later, whether it's in the same language or a different language, is necessarily getting at exactly what Saraha meant. It's a separate issue that we don't even know who Saraha was. His biography is obscure in the extreme, but commentaries they can be useful, but they need to be used, I think, with a great deal of caution always. So I don't know if that gets at your question about commentary, but that's a little bit anyway, in very broad terms, about some of the issues involved and some of the issues that I faced in translating and trying to make sense of these verses.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah, thank you. I think maybe we can jump straight into the text now and maybe take a look at a few of the examples to really kind of get a sense of what this text is like. So I'm sharing my screen. Hopefully our audience can also see this properly. Okay, so this is the root verse by the Panchen. And so, Professor, one of the first things you want to kind of go over is the title of the text, which is really interesting.
Yeah, if you could magnify it, that would really help. It would help me anyway.
There you go.
Yeah, and just scroll it over. Yeah. So anyway, so the title of this text, as you can see, is the Genden Kagyu Rinpoche Chagchen Sawa Gelwe Zhonglam. And I mean, the way I'm not sure I can even, how do I translate that? My translation of the full title is Highway of the Conquerors, the Mahamudra root text of the precious Geiden, oral transmission. Geiden is, of course, an alternative name for the Geluk. Ganden, Geiden, Geluk, these are all common terms used throughout the sort of history of Tibet. And the tricky term here is Kagyu. Right. So those who just heard, if you just heard my translation of that term, I have it as the Genden Kagyu is the Geiden or Genden or Geluk, in effect, oral transmission. And yet there is a school of thought which has as its major proponent no one less than His Holiness the Dalai Lama himself, who says that this ought to be translated as in effect, the Geiden or the Geluk Kagyu tradition. Kagyu here in the sense of that group of schools that is one of the major orders and suborders of Tibetan Buddhism, that order in which Mahamudra has been most central. And His Holiness puts forward a variety of different arguments for this, showing, among other things, the influence of the Kagyu in this text and on the Panchen Lama, talking as well about the importance of Kagyu teachers for Tsongkhapa, the supposed originator of this Mahamudra tradition. Anyway, His Holiness has a variety of different arguments for this as a translation. The problem with, and you can also understand that there's for him a kind of an agenda. I'm not saying I don't think he's being irresponsible at all in a scholarly sense. He's a great scholar and he has his reasons for arguing this, but it's helpful, of course, to have ecumenical movements within Tibetan Buddhism, and His Holiness has always stressed that the unity of the different Tibetan schools. And I think that one of his motivations for arguing for the point of view that he does is to promote ecumenism among the Tibetan schools. The difficulty, there's no time to go into this in great detail, but the difficulty with this point of view is that when the commentaries, and here the commentaries can be helpful, the Panchen himself doesn't talk about the title and the significance of it. So he leaves it undiscussed. But when you do begin to look at the word-by-word commentaries that appear in the 18th and the 19th centuries, their whole take on it is precisely the translation that I gave it, that the term Kagyu is meant here in its general sense as an oral transmission, because that, after all, is what the word Kagyu means. And therefore, this, for them anyway, this is simply the Geluk oral transmission, which is this whole special set of teachings that goes back to Tsongkhapa, who received them from Manju Gosha, who got them from Vajradhara. And so it's always got that imprimatur of a Buddha behind it. I mean, somebody who wants to argue along the lines that His Holiness prefers here could point out that this is exactly what you, Jackson, were just saying a few minutes ago, that some of these later commentators in the 18th, 19th centuries had Gelukpified the tradition, and therefore, of course, they're going to read that particular expression, Genden Kagyu, as referring to the Geluk and not as some kind of syncretism or synthesis between the Geluk and the Kagyu. So there's definitely room for play here. At the very least, I think we don't know exactly what the Panchen had in mind. What we can say is that all the textual evidence we have from the tradition after about 1700 points toward the meaning of this phrase as simply being the Genden oral transmission or oral lineage. So again, just what the meaning that a simple term can have. It has great significance, of course, for how you read this text, how you think about the practice, and so forth. Yeah.
But it kind of makes you think about, whether differentiating, these Tibetan Buddhist schools into, the Kagyus, the Geluks, is more of a kind of modern scholarly kind of exercise, or?
I would say no, but with the qualification that as you follow Tibetan intellectual and religious history from, let's just say, from the year 1000 on, beginning roughly with what's called the Chidar, the later spread of the teaching, that there is a lot of free play earlier on. And then as time goes on and institutions are built and lineages are established, there comes to be greater and greater differentiation. Certainly, by the time of Tsongkhapa even, there are very clear differentiations among the different lineages. It's not that, Tsongkhapa is, of course, exemplary in having gone and studied with teachers from absolutely every lineage. And many of the greatest Tibetan masters right down to the present day have followed that kind of an example. But definitely in terms of institutional history, and then which gets tied in with political history, there comes to be a kind of a calcification over time. And there's no doubt that the Panchen, he knew the term Kagyu, and whether he was being playful and deliberate in the ambiguity of it, we don't really know, but he certainly knew of the Kagyu and specific, and particular subgroups within the Kagyu as part of the religious landscape in which he lived. And he knew the Nyingma, he knew Che traditions, the Shije traditions, the Sakya, and so forth. In fact, he refers to them in a very important verse in the root verses, which we perhaps don't have the time to get into, but it's I'll just say that it's a famous verse, much discussed and even debated among Gelugpas, but appreciated by other schools as well, in which he basically lists most of the great practice traditions of his day, and says that, this is a paraphrase and not an exact translation, but that yogis who are knowledgeable in scripture and have meditative experience, when they examine all these different traditions, they realize that they all come down to gong chik. Gong is a word that means intention, purport, possibly meaning, idea. It's definitely a very strong statement of the unity of all these different Tibetan traditions. And there were Gelugpas who really appreciated this. There were Gelugpas who in effect said, oh, there must be some special skillful means the Panchen's employing here, which is another way of saying they don't quite get it. Or some would say, oh, it's just a joke, because as kind of orthodox exclusivist Gelugpas, they couldn't imagine that you could say that somebody, for instance, who adheres to the idea of zhentong, emptiness of extrinsic existence, which is anathema to many Gelugpas, that you could possibly be in the same group, as it were, with people like that. So anyway, that's a slight digression, but it helps make the point about the complexity of intersectarian relations and the ways in which these get played out between and among the different groups, but also within groups. So there have been exclusivist Gelugpas and there have been inclusivist Gelugpas, and the Panchen is clearly an inclusivist. The Dalai Lama is clearly an inclusivist, and I think most, but not all, modern Gelugpa teachers tend to fall into the inclusivist camp. But yeah,
it's fascinating. And the other term that you wanted to look at is this term right here, right? Sengi Chuni.
Senki Chuni, yeah. And here, I mean, it's I think even students without too much experience will recognize Sem as mind. It's about as basic a term in Tibetan philosophical and epistemological literature as you can get. And Chuni is, of course, the pretty consistent Tibetan translation of the Sanskrit word dharmata. And the question here for the translator is, how do you translate this? Some people will simply opt for dharmata itself, I haven't seen too many people who opt for just leaving it as chunyi, but dharmata, because it's difficult to translate into English, is sometimes by translators simply left on its own. I think that the way that I have tended to translate it is as something like reality. You can argue about that. There are it's equivalent in many cases to shunyata or emptiness, but maybe it gives a slightly more positive cast to it. The way a term like suchness, daishinyi or dainyi, sometimes is regarded as a slightly more positive way of referring to the same idea as emptiness. So really the point I'm raising here is, do you leave it in a Sanskrit form? Do you try to find an English equivalent that you could, if you were being literal, you'd say something like dharma-ness, all right, because the ni gives it this sense of ness, but that in English that doesn't work. It's you're very careful and safe and literal, but it tells the reader almost nothing. So this is the kind of choice that, broadly speaking, you often face as a translator, is the push and pull between a literal but perhaps almost incomprehensible translation and a translation that plays fast and loose with the original for the sake of supposed comprehensibility. I think I've tended to err in general in my translation work towards the side of literalness, but not at the cost of comprehensibility, I hope. Anyway, so every translator has to find her or his own happy balance there, and I appreciate the works of anybody from somebody pretty literalist in their approach like Jeffrey Hopkins to somebody kind of very creative in their approach like Herbert Gunther. These when I was in grad school these were the kind of polar opposites that my fellow grad students and I found ourselves pulled between. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and this one, I think in your book you translate it as the real nature of mind, and
right,
and I think this term comes up a few other times in the text too.
Right. Thank you for reminding me of that. Yeah.
No worries. And then the other term that we wanted to take a look at, which is a fascinating term, is right here.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Nampa Benbön.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is another like chunyi. This is a term that not everybody wants to even translate. I've heard a number of contemporary lamas, including contemporary or recent lamas from Geluk Rinpoche to Yangtze Rinpoche, who really just want to leave it in the Tibetan because it's so difficult to translate precisely in English. Just for some context, this is a state that you enter into when, having done preliminary practices, including, most importantly, guru yoga, your guru comes to the crown of your head and dissolves into you. And at that point, you enter into this state of Nangwa Benbön. I translate this, let's see, as a state where appearances are indistinct. Nangwa is appearances. Benbön is the really tricky term here. But I've seen, I'll just read you a few other alternatives for this. A state of miscellaneous appearances, a state of fleeting appearances, a state of diverse perceptions, a state of evanescent appearances, that state which is without the gurgle of appearance making and appearances. I love that. A state where you are indistinct from your guru, a very different take on it, although in a practice context, it makes sense. This state in which all haphazard appearance making and appearances have been contracted until they have disappeared. So there's many ways of talking about it. In more recent times, because I was Yangtze Rinpoche and I were co-teaching a course at Maitripa College on this and other Mahamudra texts, and a word that I might substitute now if I were to revise might be inchoate appearances that haven't quite come together. And from this, you then settle into a shamatha meditation, a serenity or calm abiding meditation on the nature of the conventional nature of the mind as clear and aware. But this Nangwa Benbun precedes that. And it's, according to both Geluk Rinpoche and Yangtze Rinpoche, there's a sort of what the French would call a frisson, this kind of there's a sense of bliss in it, because you've just had your guru absorb into you, but it's not nothing distinct about it. You're not thinking anything in particular, but he points out it's not like you're going into a swoon or you're asleep. So it's a very difficult term to translate. And Geluk Rinpoche, for his part, he just said, we're going to call this the NBB experience for Nangwa Ben Bun. And he may be right about that, but I perhaps foolishly went ahead and translated it as well. And others obviously have fallen into the same trap.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it kind of, tells you how amazing the Tibetan language is, right? It captures that kind of ineffability that isn't there in other languages, like in English. So,
yeah,
it's fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean, the meditative literature is full of terms like this that are elusive, and yet they convey something to someone with real experience in the tradition.
And then the next term, Yangna here. So this is a term that we often see in classical Tibetan literature. And there's many ways to translate this, but in your book, in your translation of the text, you kind of took this term as alternatively.
Yeah.
Can you tell us your process of making that translation?
Yeah, well, so the meditative context, this is not far. This is when you are, in fact, beginning to settle into concentrating on the clear and aware nature of mind. And it basically, Yangna it's probably best translated most of the time as alternatively, but it's often translated as moreover, which can means like in addition, right? So there's this, and then there's also this as a continuation of that, or is it something separate and different? That's the issue with Yangna often. And here, what the Panchen describes first is a process of sort of you're settling into concentration on the clear, aware nature of mind. You're trying to maintain mindfulness and alertness for Drenpa and Sheishin. Those are my translations for those. And when thoughts arise, as they will, you simply note them. Now, then comes Yangna, and either it means and furthermore what follows, or alternatively. And I think it's probably to be taken as alternatively, because what he describes next is or alternatively, you can cut them off like a skillful sword fighter. And the image here, which is well known from Indian literature, actually, is of a swordsman so skillful that he can ward off the arrows being shot at him by a great archer. So as thoughts come in, you repel them. So do you note them? Do you repel them? These, maybe you go from one to the other. If you try noting them and it doesn't work, then maybe you got to, in effect, fend them off. Or these are just simply two approaches you can take, depending on your own mental disposition, depending on how you're feeling that day. I took it that way. I think most commentators have taken it that way, but it's an arguable point. Yeah. And we'll come to another Yangna shortly, but let's go on to the next one here.
Yes, indeed. So there's another Yangna that we can talk about
right
in a minute.
And so this now is talking about after you've excuse me, after you've more or less relaxed the mind into, you've been able to sort of calm your mind a bit, and he quotes Saraha and Machik Laptun about relaxing the mind, and of course this is very common from Kagyu Mahamudra literature too, and shows the influence of the Kagyu on the Panchen. But in any case, he then goes on to say that at that time, when you when you investigate or analyze, it says Madrip Tong Sel Hrigewa Tongwa. So you see Tongwa, and then the question is, what's the relation among these terms? It seems to be pretty clear there's four terms. There's Madrip, which means something like unobstructed. There's Tong, which means empty or vacuous. There's Sel, which means clear or luminous. And there's Hrige, which means something like vivid. And I actually have had two printings of this book. I've been fortunate to be able to do that. And in the first printing of it, the way in which I translated this particular expression was, when you examine the settled mind, you see an unobstructed, clear, and vivid vacuity. So this is relating them adjectivally and nominally in certain ways. But over the course of time, in discussions with Yangtze Rinpoche, I became convinced that his take was correct, and that these are simply four separate items, that these are the qualities that the settled mind has when you investigate it. So in effect, it's a matter. So the way I have translated now is, the settled mind, you see non-obstruction, vacuity, clarity, and vividness. And I looked. I don't think we have the time to go through this, but this phrase is probably translated more differently by the various English translators of this text than anything else in it. There's just a tremendous variety, and most of them, in fact, do translate it with a kind of, trying to decide what's a noun and what's an adjective here. And the broader problem here, we don't have to niggle about that particularly, but the broader problem is, this is a poetic text, and one of the deep difficulties in translating Tibetan poetic texts is that because of the overwhelming dominance of meter, that is on the number of beats in a line, there is often the excision of the helpful, very helpful prepositional or postpositional particles that would give you a sense of what the relation is between these. And again, here, the Panchen's commentary on his own text doesn't really give us a very helpful perspective on it, and there's many possible ways of reading this. And this is this is a problem I'm facing in my current work on Saraha as well, where we don't have any Indic originals for most of his works, and you can read a line four different ways, and it's often you just have to hope that you've read enough stuff over the years and have a feel for somebody's overall style, that you can kind of guess what likely would be the meaning, but it's got to be very tentative. It's got to be very modest. And as I noted about Saraha, we don't know who he was even, so, or whether all the texts attributed to him are actually his. So that's a bigger problem, of which this particular sort of line and a couple of line plus is an instantiation, and it's maybe the most outstanding example of this in the Panchen's root verses, but this is something that those of you who will be translating Tibetan poetry will be running into all the time. And it's just the commentaries can be helpful sometimes, but not always, and sometimes you just got to take a shot.
Yeah, this is a very kind of I can see how difficult that is in this line. It's which one is an adjective,
Right.
which one is the verb,
Right.
which one is the noun.
Right.
It can get really tricky.
Yeah.
And after that, we have another yangna that
Yes.
you want to
I love
talk
these
about.
yangnas, and Uh, this is another example where, to give credit where it's due, my conversations with Yangtze Rinpoche changed the way I thought about this and actually changed the way I translated it in the second printing of the book, which mostly was a matter of repairing typos, but I did get a chance to just change a few things that I thought were wrong or could be improved. And here, basically this is in the Hlagtong section. So this is the if you will, the emptiness meditation portion of it, and meditating on the emptiness of the mind. And he's quoted Nagarjuna at some length, a particular passage from the Ratnavali that talks about the emptiness of the six elements: earth, water, fire, wind, space, and consciousness. He says, I'm translating here from my translation, in accordance with that statement, when you search, you do not find even the minutest particle of meditative equipoise, the one who rests in equipoise, and so forth. So there is no Mahamudra meditator, in effect. And he says, at that time, maintain a space-like meditative equipoise, single-pointedly and without distraction. So then comes Yangna. And in the first printing of the book, I said, moreover, and figured that, okay, you've settled into this meditative equipoise, and now you go, if it says from within this meditative equipoise, within that state of equipoise, it then goes on to say that the mind is not physical; it's pure vacuity, unobscured, where various things appear and proliferate. This is actually, in some ways, a kind of a paraphrase of those four terms that we were looking at just a minute ago, differently contextualized. Be that as it may, I thought that this was like the next step in the meditation. Okay, you've gone through this analysis provided you by Nagarjuna, and now you're going to kind of recognize that this state of the absence of intrinsic existence of the mind has these various qualities. But Yangtze Rinpoche argued, and I became convinced that he was right, that the Yangna, just as before, actually ought to mean or alternatively. And that in effect, because the Panchen then goes on to do a different kind of analytical quotation, this one from Shantideva, from that would be the 8th chapter of the Bodhicharyavatara, where he gives the famous example of he says, well, to quote Shantideva, he says, so-called continuums and collections, such as rosaries, armies, and the like, are false. And I just thought this was a further development of the emptiness meditation, but you can make a case that there are really two different ways of coming at the emptiness meditation, the one based on Nagarjuna and the one that's based on Shantideva. Anyway, I was persuaded enough by Yangtze Rinpoche's arguments here, and we went back and forth about this a lot. We had a lot of fun, that I switched my moreover to an alternatively or, and such that this becomes then a different way you can meditate on emptiness. Just as in the example from the Shine section, you could either try to note thoughts as they arose, or you could cut them off like a skillful sword fighter. But again, none of this is absolutely settled. There's no determinate, absolute answer to this. It's just, but it shows you that how even a single translator can publish a book and feel pretty good about their translations, and then next thing you know, somebody's convinced you that, well, I think that I could do better.
It's definitely difficult. I mean, just one small word can really make a huge difference in the translation. Right. Yeah. Right. And then we have these two words. So let me pull the screen over here. Natsu and Nitsu. Yeah.
And really, I highlighted these only to make the point that although this text is a meditation manual above all, it also is a text that's deeply informed by the Panchen's own understanding of Geluk philosophical literature, because there's in Geluk discussions of Madhyamaka and sort of how things appear mistakenly to us, there's a set of two or really three Sul terms. Sul means like mode or way. And the ones that the Panchen is focusing on here are Nangsul, which is the way things appear to us, which then actually leads to things appear to us, as we know, certainly from Tsongkhapa's system and most other Buddhist systems, they appear to us as possessing intrinsic existence. So we then grasp at them, we dzin them wrongly, and that's actually what's called zinsul. So we have then a wrong way of apprehending them, but there is in fact a natesul. There is a way or a mode in which they actually abide or exist, and that of course is as empty of intrinsic existence. So this is all these terms are not particularly controversial. It's just my main point is just to show that even in a meditation manual, there is the subtle or not so subtle working in of a deep knowledge of the sort of entire Geluk philosophical system, especially the Geluk take on Madhyamaka, which of course is not the same take on Madhyamaka as you find in many of the Kagyu schools. And there's we could go into a whole thing about points where the Panchen himself, however influenced he may have been by the Kagyu, however sympathetic he may have been to the Kagyu in certain respects, how at the same time he does dismiss elements of their standpoint.
Fascinating. And then lastly, we have this term. This term started right over here.
Right.
So
It's Minkyang Takyutsam. Again, without being too precise about it, the way in which I do translate this, this is talking about. The context of the verse is, yet when you arise from meditative equipoise and analyze, it is undeniable. So you've been in an equipoise on emptiness, right? That's what Mahamudra in the truest sense on the sutra level for Gelukpas means. When you arise from equipoise and analyze, so this is basically the post-meditation state. Jegom, right, is what it's, or J-top, you get both. J-top is probably a little more common. It's undeniable that dependently arisen actions and agents naturally appear as mere names only labels. So that's mere names only labels is my translation for this. And again, this is not, there are other ways you could translate this, imputations, designations, and so forth. Many people have done it. That's not my point here. My point, as with the previous instance, is to show that the Panchen is deeply informed by standard Geluk terminology, and this relates to the kind of classic. It's probably not unique to the Geluk, but the Geluk make a big point of it. The sort of tripartite nature of dependent arising and its relation to emptiness. Of course, Tsongkhapa was famous for emphasizing the equivalence of these, just as Nagarjuna had done in the 24th chapter of his Madhyamaka Karikas, especially 24:18. But here, there's a specific implicit reference when talking about dependently arisen phenomena. Yes, they arise and they infallibly, cause and effect follow. Because of course, we know that, again, from Nagarjuna originally, that emptiness does not negate dependent arising, but is equivalent to it. And dependent arising in turn proves emptiness, because on the sort of coarsest level, because things arise through causes and conditions, and therefore they're not independently, intrinsically existent, or a little more subtly, they are composites based on their parts, the sort of mereological analysis. And this is considered the subtlest level of analysis, dependently arisen phenomena are empty because they exist only on the basis of being named or designated or labeled in some way. So there's a lot that's packed into this particular reference that the Panchen makes within the course of his verses. So,
Thank you. This is really interesting. You see, there's a lot of like you said, Geluk references, right, packed into this root text, and you just have to really know
yeah,
how to look at them.
Same with the Kagyu references, which tend to be more in the Shine section, and when you get to the Hlagtong, though, that's where you see, oh yeah, this is really a Gelukpa text, even if it borrows from elsewhere.
Yeah, and then the text has a lot more things to offer, but due to time constraints, we won't have time to really go through the text with Professor Jackson. But thank you so much for watching. Professor, do you have any kind of additional words you want to share with our listeners?
No, I mean, I just I particularly urge those of you who are interested in Tibetan poetry to take a shot at it, but as I suggested, to be very modest about what we can or can't get from this. And it's an utter cliche, but I would say to translators, to thine own, quoting Hamlet, I believe, or somebody from Shakespeare, to thine own self be true. You have to. Everybody's got to find their own way of working these things out. I mean, it's of course important to be aware of how other people translate things, what other people's theories of translation may be. But it's we're all, those of us who are translators, we're all part of an ongoing dialogue and sometimes argument. I've heard publishers in particular say, man, nobody can argue with each other the way translators can. People can get very dogmatic about their systems, their choices for particular terms. And I guess my plea to translators is don't be dogmatic, be flexible, study your text, know your stuff, but be willing to consider that you may well be wrong, as I myself have done between two different printings of my own book. And remember the oft quoted and again almost cliched Italian expression, traduttore traditore, which means in English, as I think almost everybody listening will know, translator equals traitor. Because you are, by the very act of translation, you are betraying the original text. But without translation, how do we communicate? We translate even among ourselves in our own language all the time. So have fun.
Yep. We'll do our best and have fun in the process. All right. Thank you so much, Professor Jackson, for taking your time to talk to us. And thank you, everybody, for watching our channel. Thank you.
Daigengna Duoer